Guys, before I invite up our first guest, I want to just sometimes we have these conversations and some of y'all are like, I don't know any of the words you're using. So, quick show of hands. Who here has just ever heard of or is aware of the fact that talking about women in ministry or women in leadership or women in the church is a conversation or a debate that people have? Just if you are aware of that fact, raise your hand. Okay, cool. If you know where you stand on it, fun question, have you ever heard somebody on the other side make a compelling argument? Not that it changed your mind, but it was like, dang, that was a good argument. Just show of hands, like you've heard some decent arguments. Okay, who here is like, I don't know anything about this, I came for the beer? A few, couple, okay, that's fair. This is for you. Okay, so we're talking about women in ministry tonight. I'm sure when we get into the panel, we'll also be talking about women in the home and all that kind of stuff. But just to give you some broad strokes, everyone that's gonna be up here tonight believes some things like men and women were created by God, equal in value, right? They're made with God's image. That's a foregone conclusion. But the question becomes, when it comes to the church, leadership positions in the church, what do we do with some of those verses that seem to maybe sound like women ought not be pastors or speak or teach? And so on one end of the spectrum tonight, there are people that say, yes, men and women are created with equal value, but they have different proclivities, different roles that best serve the church. Those roles complement each other, so they are complementarian. I'm going to make you all say this word with me in a second. The word is complementarian. On the count of three, we're all going to say it. Is this not so much fun? I bet they do this at RTS. 1, 2, 3. Complementarian. Beautiful. I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. Okay. On the other side, as it were, and there are more positions than just these two, but that's kind of where we're going to be hanging out tonight. There's some other stuff that maybe we'll get into, but are people that say men and women are made in God's image, equal in value, and they can equally fill the roles in the church, like pastor, leader, teacher, elder, deacon, deaconess, all those kinds of things, that there's full equality, and that word equality sounds like egalitarian, which is the name of this side, egalitarianism. I'm going to say it one more time, and then we're going to say it together. Egalitarianism. Say it with me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Egalitarianism. All right. So maybe you know where you are in that, but we're going to have two guest speakers that are kind of going to present each of those sides. You get to then text in your questions to them and a larger panel of pastors and professors who are going to kind of try to help us understand why is this a thing that we talk about. But let me say one last thing before I invite Lynn up to start us off. At Theology by the Pint, we love to have conversations about sticky wickets in a way that's gracious and charitable. We have a little bit of sense of humor, and we share a beer at the end of the night. And we agree that while it's very important, it is not, the fancy word is salvific. It's not affecting your salvation. There are going to be the other side people in heaven, okay? This is not something that's like, if you don't get right, Jesus is like, ooh, like it can't let you in, okay? If you put your trust in Jesus, and if you haven't put your trust in Jesus, we would love to talk to you about that tonight. I know we have people here from every part of the continuum of spiritual journey. So we call it a secondary issue. It's important, but it is not going to get you into heaven. So we can all just collectively breathe a sigh of relief. You don't have to agree with everyone that's on the stage tonight, but we're going to have some fun. Sound good? All right, so where is Lynn? I'm going to invite her to come get us started. Come on up. Here you go. Have fun.
This is a hard act to follow. I'm a morning person. I'm just kind of tired already. I need some of Sarah's energy. I'm Dr. Lynn Cohick, recently relocated to the wonderful city of Houston from cold Chicago. So I'm thrilled to be here. I am working at the Houston Theological Seminary, which is, we got some alum and current students there. And I'm the director of the Houston Theological Seminary. And also, and there's no living with me now, is my husband there, I'm the distinguished professor of New Testament. Yeah, I know, that's just so, my mom's very proud and my dogs love me. Sarah was talking about a story that I had shared with her that she thought might be helpful to start our conversation with. I came to faith when I was in high school, and through college felt like I really wanted to learn more about Scripture, and I wanted to get into teaching. I had a slight flirtation with teaching little kids, and then realized that's not good. So I shifted out of that, and all children are now in a much much safer space. But I thought, well, I want to go on and get my PhD in New Testament, and the track that I saw that would make, the most sense was to go to seminary. That's what my pastor did, and so I just thought that's what I should do. The church that we were a part of, it was an evangelical free church. However, they would not sign a letter of recommendation for me to go and study at the seminary because I wanted to study Bible. They would sign a letter if I would study Christian education. We've already learned that that was not going to be a good fit, or church history. So I never went to seminary. And, well, it's not true. I did a couple of classes. I finished in 3.5 years my undergrad, so I took a couple of classes at a seminary before starting at the University of Pennsylvania, which has been in the news. That's where I did my PhD, and just went straight from undergrad there. So I think God has a hilarious sense of humor that I'm a director now of a seminary, and my previous 2 jobs were as provosts at 2 other different seminaries. So anyway, I just kind of think that's funny. So where do I fall on the issue of women in church roles? Although we did learn the language of complementarian and egalitarian, and I think those terms had a lot of force in the 1980s, and maybe even into the 90s. But I think now there's such a broad range of options that I don't know how informative it is for me to just say to you, well, I'm an egalitarian, because they just can mean so many different things. So what I would say is that I believe that God will gift men and women for the purposes that he's called them for. And if that is to be a senior leader in a church or parachurch organization, then I think a woman can do that. But it's got to be a call by God. Yeah. So that's where I would stand with that. I think, and Sarah has already mentioned this, but I also jotted this down. The New Testament is most concerned that we are faithful, that we don't lose our first love, that we speak the truth in love, and that we allow the Spirit to work in us as we are being transformed from one glory to another, and we are predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. That's where we're all heading. And so it's in that context that I talk about what I think women and men can do in the church. Biblical reasons for why I would hold this position. Just recently, for example, I'm on the, I won't give too much away. Anyway, I was in a conversation where someone was thinking about me being part of their organization, and they asked, though, about how do you feel about women in leadership. It was a kind of a general question, but they said, I bet you start in 1 Tim 2. And I said, I don't, actually. I start with Deborah, Huldah, Phoebe, Priscilla, Junia. And it looks like this is a group that knows a lot of those names. Like, that's where I start. Paul has said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so he works with Euodia and Syntyche, that's Philippians 4, and they're his co-workers. I look at that first, and I think Paul's going to be consistent in his actions. So I imagine a team of men and women who are gospeling to the Greco-Roman world in the major cities. Paul has hung out with Andronicus and Junia. They're now in jail for preaching the gospel. And so when I see that he has no trouble at all with that kind of leadership team, that's what I take to look at some of the tough passages, including the one that we're to look at tonight, which is 1 Tim 2, starting in verse 11. And I thought, well, I just have to wear this t-shirt then for you. So on the t-shirt, as you can see, it has, let her learn. That's how the text starts. And in Greek, it's in the command or imperative. You wouldn't necessarily think it with the English translations. Sometimes a woman should learn in quietness and full submission, right? That the focus is on quieting her down. But this is the command, let her learn. And Paul, I think, puts it in the command form in part because Timothy is ministering in Ephesus. And unlike the Jewish women and men who were in synagogue together every week, and the word of Moses is read every week, as James tells us in Acts 15. The pagan women have no parallel educational opportunities. There's no pagan synagogue kind of thing. So Timothy is commanded to figure out how he's going to train these newly converted Gentile women to know the word. I am not permitting is actually in the indicative. It's how I just said it. I'm not permitting. That's the translation. So I'm very committed to helping women learn. And as I help women learn, I'm thrilled to have men learn as well. I'll close with, because I think my time's, I probably would shot way over it. I was interviewed for my job at Wheaton College. That's where I started in 2000 in my being a professor. And so I'm interviewed in this room of 6 men. We're in this conference room in a hotel, because that's used to be the case that at a big meeting, institutions would hold their interviews. So we're in this windowless room. There's 6 men around this table. And one of them, we're talking for a little while, and then one of them says, "So what do you think about, Paul saying to Timothy that women need to be silent?" And I just didn't say anything. It's amazing I got the job, but I just sat there. To me, it was a moment of real genius. You know how when you think you wish you had done that, but you think about it after the moment? This was in the moment. So I'm just sitting there, not saying anything. And then one of the fellows, 2 seats away from me, starts to chuckle. Then another starts to chuckle, and they finally got it. Anyway, there you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, Natasha, you're up. So while she's walking up, I will tell you, it was very difficult to find somebody on the other side of things to come and speak. We definitely wanted to have 2 women speak. If we're talking about women, that seemed like the right thing. And someone that was here at the last one heard what our topic was, told a friend, and so connected us. And then I got talking on the phone. I was like, we get kind of feisty, kind of spicy. She's like, that's fine. I can handle that. So I am excited. She works with the police. And anyway, give her a warm welcome.
Hi, so my name's Natasha Young. I graduated with a Master of Arts in Biblical Counseling from Dallas Theological Seminary. Please do not take my degree back after this. Okay. I'm also the chaplaincy manager for the Harris County Sheriff's Office. I'm a certified crisis chaplain, and I'm a senior credentialed law enforcement chaplain with the International Chapter of Police Chaplains, for anybody who knows what that is. I do death notifications for the medical examiner's office. I do live scene call-outs as a chaplain for the Harris County Sheriff's Office. And I've worked in the jail for going on 19 years. I work with the worst of the worst. If they're on the news, I probably talk to them, giving them the gospel, all of that good stuff. So my position, though, is, ironically enough, for some of you who may not believe it, complementarian. Scripturally, I believe that women laid out consistently through the Bible are created equally from men. Spiritually, we're seen equally with men. However, we're created for different roles and responsibilities in the church and in the family. We're not going to talk about that today, but in the church specifically. I think Ephesians, some of you may or may not agree, that is one of the absolute best books for us to look at when we look at doctrine. And when we look at the church, We're created as a body, and each of us have different giftings, like the professor said, and we're all supposed to work together, like the joints of the body, right? And together, we're all supposed to work in order to make the church better, to grow the church, right? Some of us have the gifting of evangelism. Some of us have the gifting of apostles. But if you look historically, there's not a single male that was called to be an apostle, even though there were females that had ministry to Jesus. And the word that was used consistently in the New Testament text for that word ministry was service unto Jesus, right? And then we have that pastor-teacher role, right? And that word for pastor is a shepherd. They're supposed to have care of that flock. It's a stewardship role that I believe is for men. Historically, that it's supposed to be for men. Jesus appointed men to that role. Even though he taught women, he was different in that, right? Women were not supposed to be being taught publicly. And he taught women publicly in front of the Pharisees. They were not supposed to be taught outside of the home if they were taught. But Mary knew Scripture, so she knew it from somewhere. She was learning, but they weren't supposed to be taught publicly. And Jesus did those things. The church is supposed to be a picture of the perfection that was in the creation, and there's order in the creation. 1 Corinthians says that there's order, and God is of order. He's not chaos, he's order. And there's that picture of order that the church follows. And that order is the church universal submits to the authority of Jesus, just as the local church submits to the authority of that shepherd pastor, just as the family submits unto, right? I do think that there are, just as I was talking to the professor earlier, there are extremes to this, that people take it out of context. We have people that would tell me that I'm out of order because of the role that I have in leadership and ministry. I'm not operating in the church as a pastor, teacher. Elizabeth Elliot is a really great example of this, right? She was, if any of you have heard of Elizabeth Elliot in her ministry roles, right? She was a woman, fantastic ministry, went out, and she would teach men privately in order for them to go out and then shepherd flocks, right? I'm not standing in front of a congregation. I never will. I never will preach in front, and I'm going to use that word preach in the sense that we know it as now, as a pastor teacher, right? Not in the biblical sense of that word, kairos, or any of those like proclaiming the word. I'm going to talk about it like standing in front of a pulpit and leading and shepherding a flock. But there are women that can handle the text much better than men. There are women that are much better equipped than men to handle the word and to teach the word. That doesn't mean that they have that role and responsibility, that stewardship of a flock. It doesn't mean that they can't teach. It just means that we don't have that stewardship, that responsibility. Just like Adam had the stewardship of Eve, men have the stewardship of the flock, just like Jesus has the stewardship of the church universal. So I am much more succinct in my version of it. I will tell you that thanks to women who went before me, I was allowed to go to seminary. I actually was questioned for being a little bit maybe too biblical in the beginning, but I was. I know that there were some women who questioned their lack of being able to participate in some of the preaching classes that are offered in seminary. And my answer to that is that is a stewardship role. And in order to steward a flock, the first concern would be whether or not you can properly handle the text, not whether or not you're allowed to have that responsibility, because great is the burden. And if we can't handle the text well, we have no responsibility wanting to have that responsibility. So we should really look at ourselves very seriously and see whether or not we are equipped to handle that before we complain about not being able to take that class. That's just my personal opinion, and I know it's offensive to some, and that's okay. But that's my personal opinion. As far as having leadership roles in ministry, I have a very large one, obviously. Harris County Jail is the second largest in the United States, and I'm the manager of that chaplaincy program. It's not a small leadership role. I do think that women have roles in leadership in ministry, and diakonos, servant roles within the church. That stewardship of being a shepherd, an elder, which also those words are those Greek words are used interchangeably. That's a different position, though, just in my opinion. So, where'd you go? I'm good. Please don't take my degree back.
Lynn, will you come back up? So they both went under time, so we have some time to brawl. Okay. And there's other people that are going to come up and make it even spicier. So, but I'm just going to give them a few minutes to, here, I'll give you this one. If you heard the other one say something like, where'd you get that from? Or why do you think that? Or can you elaborate? If you have nothing, we'll take the break and we'll get to the juicy part faster. But if you have anything, I'm going to ask you to just take a few minutes to do that. And I will just call time when it's time. What? That they've gone under? Yeah. Because they're...
We got to the point.
Yeah, that is it. That is it. Yeah. No, I think the comment, I guess, that I would say when you talk about order, I think that's really important. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think for me, where I would expand on that, or maybe differentiate myself, perhaps from where you might end up, would be that, to me, you can have order without hierarchy. So I totally agree with you that as he's saying, God is a God of order in 1 Corinthians 14, the chaos is, I imagine, both men and women speaking in tongues in the Spirit and other people not hearing it. In other words, there was a chaos such that people weren't really being able to hear and process the gospel. So that's where I would say, yes, God is a God of order, but I don't see it gender hierarchy order.
And I don't see a gender hierarchy either. I'll go back to the Trinity, where there's different roles and responsibilities of the different personhoods of the Trinity. However, there's not any hierarchy within the Trinity. And that is reflected in the order that we see, and not necessarily within Jesus and the church, because that is obviously, we do submit to that authority. But I think that we confuse that a lot, especially with the English language, that word submission. There was a really good essay that I read on eternal submission of Jesus to the Father, the Son to the Father. And the point was made that word of submission is not necessarily that he's any less than the Godhead, right? It's that we all know that within the Trinity, there's that equality of the personhoods, but there's different roles and responsibilities. And that same thing, I believe, is seen within males and females. And spiritually, we're equal. Creation-wise, we're all equal. But we have different roles and responsibilities. And I don't think that Jesus, when the women were doing their ministry to him, saw that the men were any better than the women at all during his ministry. But there was a distinction between the ministry of women and the ministry of men while he was on earth.
I'm going to go with the Trinity thing here, if that's all right.
I know she was going to go there. I know.
Well, the eternal subordination of the Son to the Father, depending on how it's worded, and this kind of was a firestorm a couple of years ago online, you do skate pretty close to heretical. Not you, but others.
Yes.
Who aren't skilled in skating. Yes. Skate close to the edge. So I think that, at least in the West, when you think about the Trinity, you have the immanent or ontological Trinity that is the three persons in one. And then you have the economic Trinity. And it's called economic Trinity because of the Greek that's behind this word, but it's the salvation side of things. And in that, you have, maybe you could even talk about the procession of the Son and the Spirit from the Father. But in the economic trinity, that's where we would locate the incarnation, right? So where do you have the second person of the Trinity taking on flesh? In that salvation history of the incarnation, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension, Jesus now, in his resurrected physicality, whatever that looks like, is interceding for us always. And in that sense, as he represents us, there is in his humanness a subordination that humanness takes. But there is only one divine will. And that's where I would say you get into trouble when you talk about roles and imagine that the human, like marriage, we'll say, with my husband, as great as our marriage is, we have two wills. I'm always right, and there's, I mean, it makes it simple that way to just, we're probably not stopping at Dairy Queen on the way home after that comment. I know, I just blew it. This really, though, is seriously, I think the point to note with this, when you map even the economic trinity onto human relationships, analogies are always helpful in certain ways, but you just have to remember the Godhead has one will, and that's keeps us from skating right off the edge.
And I think that because we live in the brokenness of this world, any analogy is not going to work. Let's just get that straight. Any analogy that we try and use is going to be flawed in some way. We also live in a fallen and broken world. So even though we should have one will, and that should be the will of the Father, just like Jesus had the will of the Father, just like they are in union, we don't, because we live in brokenness. And until we are free of sin and glory, we're just not going to be in that perfection. Because of that, we have this conversation that we're having now. And because of that, we have this struggle where we have this idea that women are less than because we use that word subordination or because we use that word submission. And I will say this, and it's offensive to a lot of men, the problem is not women not submitting. The problem is weak leadership from men, right?
And I would even go a little bit that when they talk about the women's issue, for me, I really do think it is actually about how men want to define masculinity. I was at a Cubs game, sorry, this was way back in my early life, before I saw the light and came to Houston. But I was with a student and watching the game. I'm not really a baseball fan, so I was bored. And he was talking to me about how he was raised with egalitarian parents, but that he himself is a complementarian. And I said, oh, why is that? He said, because egalitarianism does not tell me what it means to be a man. And I have taken that. He was really genuine, and we didn't. There was no hostility in his voice, and I really took that seriously, his observation. And I think it is important as we have these conversations about what women can do. It's because in the background there's assumptions about what men can do and what make men men that allow them to do it. So. That's a good place to stop.
Okay, so many people texted, they're being too nice to each other. But don't worry. No, I'm so glad you guys are nice to each other. What's that? Oh my gosh.
This is how it should be, though.
TBTP.
What? Yeah, this is how it should be, though. I mean, I'm not faking it. Like, I'm not inside seething. Like, I really want to say other things.
He said throw a chair. Okay, it's not Maury Povich, but what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break, and then we are going to bring some more voices up here, which might make it a little more spicy for those of you that are, not entertained enough. But you can also get some more beer. That makes everything more fun. And there is more food. Marquise has generously opened it up to everyone, even if you didn't pay for social hour. He's Methodist. They're very nice. So we're gonna take a break for, what's that? An open table. It's not fenced at all. Look at that. Okay. And don't forget, so much merch. This is your time. This is the time to get t-shirts in every color and size. And pint glasses for family and friends. What a better gift can you think of for Christmas than a pint glass or 12? Stickers, just take the stickers. Y'all, everything must go. Okay? Meet back here in 10 minutes and we'll do some more. Thank you guys. Hey guys, Sarah here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is an amazing podcast episode, but I just wanted to tell you that Theology by the Pint is growing. We are now a 501c3 nonprofit organization and we're expanding. This coming year, with your help, we'll grow our reach by adding events in multiple Houston suburbs, as well as launch a youth version. Don't worry, those will be pints of iced coffee, not beer. We're adding follow-up conversations to reach the spiritually curious and the unchurched. We're also growing our connections and partnerships with more local churches, and you can help us grow by praying for us, by telling your friends or church about us, and of course, by partnering with us financially. To donate, go to theologybythepint.org/give. You know, if each of our podcast listeners gave $100, we would reach our annual budget right then. Consider donating today. Okay, enjoy the rest of the show. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys, we have 2 mics to share among, there's one down there, so maybe one can hover down here and one can hover over here. I'm going to ask you guys to say your name again and like where you work. What do you do that has you up here on this panel? And then we're going to launch right into the questions that have come in. So, Mayor, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Meredith Mills. I'm pastor at Westminster Methodist in the Galleria area.
Lynn Cohick, professor at Houston Christian University, New Testament.
Paul Sloan. I teach at Houston Christian University as well, and I'm the teaching pastor at Heights Church in the Heights.
And we're doing a podcast.
And Lynn and I are doing a podcast together.
Oh.
I'm Natasha Young, and I'm the Chaplaincy Services Manager for the Harris County Sheriff's Office.
I'm Cole Kirby, and I am a pastor at Sojourn Montrose Church in Montrose.
That's a really good name for it then. Yeah. Okay, so we're just going to launch right in. Question number 1, and the way it works is if you want to grab a mic and answer it, not everybody has to answer everyone, and if you want to spar a little, let's go for it. Or a lot, because people are upset about all the kindness, apparently. Okay, question for the egalitarians. We'll start on that end, as it were. If there's no distinction of roles in the way complementarianism suggests, then is there any difference between men and women? If so, what? I thought we'd start spicy. Someone else asked, what makes a woman and a man a man? So we might have biology class tonight. You want me to ask it again, the first one?
No,
You look puzzled, Paul. You have children.
It's a really good question, and I think without being biological essentialist, it does, though, come to, in certain respects, a coordination around family. If I was going to, not roles in terms of what decisions can you make, or what decisions for yourself, your family, or your church you can make. But I do think there are decisions, there are realities of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and different levels of physical strength, especially upper body strength, that are the reality that can form a community where everyone works together so that the community continues to the next generation and the next generation. It's when you make those differences more or less important, more or less valuable. You take decisions away from those who have less strength, where I would see there'd be a problem. But there are definitely differences. Those differences can be celebrated, not arranged in a hierarchical manner.
So no one else wants to weigh in on that. Okay, that's fantastic. All right, I'm just over here reading all y'all's questions. Some of you are fired. Unsubscribe. Okay, but here we go. Second question. For the egalitarians, again, from a practical point of view, most head pastors are men. Is this because God calls more men to the role, or because the culture is broken in some way? Because Lynn talked about being called. That's why I think this question came in.
I'm a female head pastor, so I did not. So I grew up in a Methodist church. My dad was my senior pastor, and we were in the same church my entire childhood. I didn't even know this was a question really until I graduated from seminary, and I got assigned to a church in East Texas, and everyone was like, "You're a woman," and I was like, "Yes." And that was when I realized that it's an issue. So I think when you look at churches where, like me, it hasn't been an issue, roughly the same number of men and women feel called into ministry. When you look at churches where it is constantly under debate, then of course women are not going to interpret what I would feel as a call into ministry as a call into ministry, because it's not an option in the church. By and large, in the United States today, overwhelmingly, between Roman Catholic and non-denominational and Southern Baptist, overwhelmingly, most of the very large churches do not celebrate women in senior leadership. So of course, young women, even if they're feeling a call into ministry, are not going to interpret it as such necessarily. But that doesn't mean that women are not being called into ministry. So I would say that even my friends who came to, it was interesting when I was first appointed to a church and I was preaching. Even my friends who were fully egalitarian, who grew up in the same church I had, they had never seen a woman preach before, right? They'd only seen my dad. My dad is also fully egalitarian. He's also male. But they'd never seen a woman preach before. And afterward, they were like, that felt weird, because they had never seen it. And it wasn't that they had a problem with it, they had just never seen it. If a young woman is growing up and she feels this fire within her, and she has never seen it, she's not going to interpret it as I'm called to preach, because it's never been presented to her.
And she might get a lot, even if she has an inkling, she might get a lot of pushback from people that she cares very deeply about and that care deeply for her. And so it can sometimes just isn't worth the trouble.
Okay. Y'all are so funny because you're like, they're so nice, but none of you are sending in really spicy questions. Is somebody else going to say something? Awesome.
Yes.
But I'm not going to make the joke. Go.
So from the complementarian standpoint on that, the word preaching in the New Testament is proclaiming the good news of the gospel or of the kingdom. Women are not excluded from that anywhere. We can give the gospel to anyone at any point in time. And in fact, we are called to do that if we have that gifting. From the complementarian standpoint, it's a specific role and responsibility of shepherding and teaching. Those two go together in Ephesians. It's not some shepherds and some teachers. It's some shepherd teachers. That's where, I don't know if you agree with me completely, but that's where I come from on that there are absolutely women who are very, very gifted in preaching, which is proclaiming the good news. And there is nowhere that excludes women from exercising that in ministry, because there are tons of roles in ministry and within the church universal. Again, we're a body that works together. It's just, for me, and I don't know if you agree, it's it's that specific role. And I know that you all disagree, but I think that complementarianism gets a very bad reputation in speaking and saying that women have been excluded altogether from that, and it's only a man's world when it comes to ministry and church and preaching or evangelism or any of those.
Saw somebody else. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, as I have it up here, Ephesians 4:11, they're plural nouns that are naturally in the masculine because they would be that, but there's not an indication, as I see it, that these are gender-coded male. Is there? So where do you get that in the shepherd? I'm looking at the shepherd and teacher.
Did you want to?
Yeah. So the Bible would be a puzzle pieces, and they all fit together. Yeah. And so from that one text, I'm not going to get that whole thing that it's gender-coded male, which I agree. But then if we're going to put Titus, we're going to put Corinthians, we're going to put everything together. Junie is a female, but she's not an apostle.
She is an apostle.
Actually, why don't you guys open that up a little bit, because that's one of the questions that came in. Talk about Junia. And for people in the audience who are like, who the heck is Junia? Give us a little background.
Yeah, so Junia, I would agree, is female, but I don't agree that she is an apostle.
So you're going to, among the apostles, you're going to interpret that, Romans 16, yes. You're going to interpret among the apostles as the apostles over here thought highly of Junia, who's over here, like among this group of apostles. That's a very odd way and minority way of understanding that particular preposition among the apostles. It's much more natural to say she just was an apostle. But you could go with apostle being messenger, which is another way of understanding the semantic range of that noun can include just messenger or apostle the way we think of Paul and the 12.
Okay, so for those of you who have no idea what's going on, Romans 16, Paul sends a bunch of personal greetings, and this is where we see a lot of the inner workings of what was actually happening in the early church. And one of the famous or infamous greetings is Junia and Andronicus, who are famous among the apostles, either naming Junia as apostle or naming Junia as famous among people who are called apostles. As was pointed out, you can make lots of arguments, but the plain text reading, if you're going to go for like a plain reading, the most obvious reading is this is a really famous female apostle. So that just throws a wrench in everybody's wheel.
Cole, did you want to weigh in on that at all? Just kidding. You hadn't talked yet, so I wanted to make sure you were grabbing the mic if you wanted it. That's all.
Is your mic on, Cole?
There's only 2 mics.
I don't have a mic. I will read the passage for those of you who are like, what is going on?
Eat it.
I'm reading from the ESV because I'm a complementarian, which I'm glad that's funny to y'all. I'm going to start in verse 3 of Romans 16. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house. Greet my beloved Epaenetus, who was the first convert to Christ in Asia. Greet Mary, who has worked hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. See, the ESV is for complementarians. Greet Ampliatus, my beloved in the Lord. It goes on to greet many people who are serving the church faithfully in the first century, particularly in the Greek and Roman world. And I do not have a comprehensive argument as to whether or not Junia is Junia or Junius, or whether Junia or Junius is an apostle or part of the apostolic community, or in some way a servant to the apostolic community. I think the evidence we have in the text, both linguistically and contextually, is minimal, and to draw a broad conclusion of females in the apostolic community when this is essentially the one extant text in the Bible that points to anything like that is at best a stretch and at most like a dangerous way to treat the scriptures, in my humble opinion.
Paul, I see a furrowed brow. Do you want to say anything? And we're going to move off of this because y'all are bringing the spice now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it seems to be a pretty large overstatement.
Eat the mic.
It seems to be a pretty large overstatement. The plain fact of it is that he greets numerous people and then names their position. After which, particularly in verse 16:7, he says, Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my co-workers, who are famous or well-known among the apostles. It doesn't seem like a stretch at all. In other words, it seems like put a lot of evaluative context into that reading, which you're calling it a stretch, and there's something about it that indicates it's a stretch. In fact, the most obvious reading of that is that they are apostles who are well known by other apostles. And so I think you'd have to make a positive case for why that's a stretch. The obvious sense of that is that they are apostles.
Well, the obvious thing in the text is that they are kinsmen and fellow prisoners. That is the most obvious linguistic thing about them.
Okay, do you have your Greek Bibles with you, anybody?
Even that's not completely obvious compared.
I know, that's why I'm asking. What does the Greek say?
It's, I mean, what we said already.
Okay.
You know,
Wonderful.
Yes, it's a small preposition that on which hangs, you know, is it among the apostles, the most natural reading, or by the apostles, which is driven, it's a minority.
Okay, I'm going to move us off of this just because the people that don't know Greek are starting to, we're losing them.
But here's one of the things, if I can make the point before we flee from this.
Please do.
She's in jail. So when we think about leadership in the church, this is not the C-suite, okay? This is jail. And Christian women in the next 2 centuries are going to give their lives, as also their male counterparts, as martyrs. So this is leadership in the church. I'm not, and I know we all up here
I say
are
amen
saying,
to that.
Exactly,
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
You know, that this is, leadership is not about self-aggrandizement, you know. So that's what I want to say about
And that's a great segue to the next question that says, if Christian ministry is a kind of or is deeply and truly spiritual warfare, ought we allow women to lead congregations? One more time. If Christian ministry is a kind of or is deeply and truly spiritual warfare, ought we allow women to lead congregations? On the front lines, as it were.
That is so interesting.
Who's, you're giggling?
You know,
No, the pastor of a church is leading a church in a spiritual warfare, and so, oh, I see.
Women are lesser warriors than men. So, yeah. So, so I will say, there's so many different kind of aspects to that question, but I will say this. At the very beginning, Adam and Eve, when Eve was a helpmate, Eve was like, that's not helper, that was like war buddy, right? And so the idea that Eve was a lesser spiritual force than Adam, I don't think is actually biblically sound. The idea that women are lesser spiritual warriors than men, I don't think is also biblically sound. And I will say, as a pastor, so one of the things I became very, very, very clear of when I was thrown into this maelstrom called ministry is what I am not capable of. I had a very specific calling, and as soon as I stood in a pulpit the first time I preached, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I was going to do. This is what I was meant to be. And then I found all these other things that I was not born to do, including like a lot of things included in my job description. And the thing about ministry that I've discovered is that it only works if the whole church functions, right? So I have a role. I have one role. I have an extraordinary team of people who are surrounding me. I have prayer warriors. I have administrative leaders. I have teachers. I have evangelists. I am far and away from being the person who does the work of the church. I have one role in guiding the church as a body to follow Jesus and bring, do whatever Jesus wants to do to bring the kingdom of God in our little corner. But I don't think that this idea of like the pastor is like the single person who's going to spiritually protect the congregation or spiritually lead the congregation is going to be accurate regardless of the gender of the pastor, right? Like you've got a team of people, the whole congregation is working together. And I think when you put that kind of pressure on pastors, you see really terrible things happen from pastors anyway. So I do think from the one hand, yes, women spiritually fight just as much as men. The best spiritual warriors I've seen in my life have been female, partly, but that's not saying that men can't do it. I'm just saying like, women can be spiritual warriors along with men, but second, like the pastor's role is not to be the person what we've made it in the mega churches, right? The person in the spotlight who is single-handedly doing all the things. It is to be one role that together with the community, with the church, brings forth what Jesus wants to do.
All right, I have so many questions, so if anybody's not jonesing to push back, we're going to move forward. If a wife, here we go, is to submit to her husband as the church is to submit to Jesus, how can we be egalitarian? If a wife is to submit to her husband as the church is to submit to Jesus, how can we be egalitarian? Like taking the house code and putting it on the church.
Yeah. So I don't know how to say this without sounding really, but I have a commentary on Ephesians. So if you want to, so I've thought about this. This is my point. I've thought about this for a long time, and how I would approach this is starting in Ephesians 5:18. Do not be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. That is a command to be filled with the Spirit. From that follows 5 participles, which are ing verbs. In the English, they become sometimes separate sentences. But in all of that, singing and making music in your heart, giving thanks to God, and submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ. All of those things wrap up into the finite verb, which is be filled with the Spirit. When you get to 5:21, submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ, the next verse is, wives to your husbands as to the Lord. There's no verb in wives submit to your husband. In the English, you have to put the verb in. But in Greek, there's no verb. The verb is taken from the previous verse, which tells us that at the very least, submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ has some relationship, close relationship, to wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So I would just say it's important to see that context, even though in some of our English translations, there's a subheading that separates the two, but they're not actually in Paul's message. The second thing I would say is that while participles can be translated as imperatives, as commands, they
If
also
I had a nickel. Sorry, keep going. I'm just being silly. Keep going. Sorry.
Well, this is an intelligent crowd. You know, they're following. This is an intelligent crowd. So for the wife, all the descriptions in those 2 or 3 verses are all in the indicative. There's no command forms there. When you get to 5:25, husbands love your wives, that's the command. And 3 times the husband is commanded in the command form. Twice the agapeo, the agape now, that verb form is command. And then once it's ought to love, but that's still a command. So the emphasis that we place on what does submit mean, and Natasha's already said that that's a virtue that all Christians have, which I heartily agree with. We're so exhausted as we try to figure out what in the world the wife's supposed to do that by the time we get to what the husband's supposed to do, we forget how incredibly revolutionary this message is for marriages. There is no other work at this time in Jewish or the Greco-Roman larger context where a husband is called to love his wife as Christ loved the church. Nowhere. So I think there were people, as this was read in church, they'd be raising their hands. Wait, what's going on? To me, the whole passage speaks of reciprocity, that the husband sees the wife as his own body. That is gospel. That is not culture at all. That is turning the culture upside down. And although Paul doesn't use the word reciprocity here, he does in Romans 7. In Romans 7, they ask Paul a question about marital relations. Sorry, thank you, 1 Corinthians 7. And Paul says, yeah, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. he's answering their question about sexuality, but he's going to qualify that, and he gets in chapter 2, verse 4. A woman does not have authority, exousia, the generic word for authority, over her own body, but her husband does. And the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And I am sure when that was read in the Corinthian congregation, because they're rowdy, there were several people in the back that said, whoa, read that again. There is just no other place except in the Christian church where you have that kind of mutual respect given to the partners. And yeah, so that's where I like to rest. And then we can talk about submission, because it's really not that much of to me, in the context of Paul, with his qualification of in the Lord, it doesn't worry me. And I want to stress the other stuff where it's really, really gospel challenging culture.
For one, Dr. Cohick, I think that was so helpful. That was beautiful. And I agree with everything you said, especially about the earth-shattering reality of the apostles and specifically Paul's ethic on marriage and the family and sexuality. And yet we do have the elephant in the room in Ephesians 5 of Christ being the head of the church and the husband being the head of the wife. And so I would argue there is the general principle of mutual submission throughout the scriptures, where all Christians are bound to submit to one another, specifically in the homes, wives and husbands submit to one another in love and respect and reverence, out of respect for God-given the imago Dei, the image of God in people, and their worthiness as members of the body of Christ, and all of those things. And yet, within that, there is still a reality where Christ is the head of the church, and the scriptures have established a pattern that is clarified by Paul in Ephesians 5 of husbands being the head of their wife. And Peter applies this principle in 1 Peter 5 to the church when he refers to Christ as the great shepherd of the flock of God, and refers to the work of pastors as being shepherding, as under shepherds. And so as Christ is the great shepherd to the flock of God, so pastors, which I believe are male, and I believe Peter believed were male, were the shepherds of the flock of God as representatives of Christ among his people. And so there can be a general principle of submission and a specific application of submission. I think that applies to teaching in the church too. Absolutely, there are examples throughout the New Testament of women teaching. Paul in 2 Timothy is praising Timothy's grandmother for teaching the gospel and being a worthy teacher of the Bible and doctrine. And yet there is this specific application of authoritative teaching, which our text that is the focus of tonight applies to, which I believe is reserved for the role of elders and pastors, which I'm convinced the scriptures teach are for men only. And so there can be mutual submission and equality in dignity while still being a significant role of headship and representation, federal representation of a household or of a congregation.
I'm so glad you used the word headship.
I was about to help him out there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so in the family, when we refer to the husband being the head, just as the pastor is the head of the local church, just as Jesus is the head of the church, I think it's very important that we clarify that spiritual leader role, right? Because just as the pastor is the shepherd, which is to feed the flock, the role of the husband is to feed spiritually the family. That is not to say that the husband dictates finances, has to be the one that makes more money, has to be the one to tell the wife what she can and can't do in all areas, and the children in all areas, because everybody is created with different giftings, right? And that includes financial abilities, intelligence abilities, skills, and job roles. So that doesn't mean that every household is going to look the same within the church. There are some households where the husband may have the gifting where he can stay home and take care of the children while the wife is gifted to be able to go and make more money financially in order to help support the local church. That doesn't mean that she is the spiritual head of that household, right? It is still his responsibility to be the spiritual leader in that household, whatever his role and responsibility is within that marriage, within their financial situation, within their economic situation, with whatever their jobs are. We have to make sure that when we look at complementarianism, we don't paint that brush too widely and say that that also looks at the corporate world, that also looks at the voting world, political realms, and all those, because I think we have the tendency to do that, and especially the modern church, to say that that submission role for women applies to every aspect, and it doesn't. It's very specific for the roles and responsibilities of that shepherding, teaching role, and then again, spiritual leader within a family.
And I would say that kephale, which I almost wish we just had this primarily. I mean, like 89, 88% of the time, kephale in the New Testament refers to the thing that is stuck on our neck. So what we have here in Ephesians 5 is the metaphorical use of kephale. And as with metaphors, they take on a dynamism. A metaphor puts two things together that you've not seen together before, and it creates meaning. And the reason I wanted to highlight headship is headship becomes a principle. But Paul's not stating a principle here when he uses the language of head and body. Okay? It's a metaphor, and we have to remember that, not leap forward with things. That's one point to note. Secondly, kephale, when you look at it metaphorically, it can mean source, like the headwaters of a river. It can be a synecdoche for the whole. So what I mean by that is, here's a great example. As I'm driving to work and I look out at a pasture, I see 40 head of cattle. And you all know that I'm actually seeing whole cows, not like something like from a horror movie, right? But actual cows. When you say the head, it's the synecdoche. It's a synecdoche for the whole thing. And that, I think, is an important option here, especially culturally, where women would have some, depending on the amount of wealth they had, whether they're a widow. And like with Lydia, for example, she ran her house. She was the head of the house, as far as we know, if I want to say it that way. But the idea of the husband being the head here, I guess I could see that culturally as having a preeminence. That's what another commentator, Thistleton is his name, who talks about. Maybe there's this preeminence as the family representative, the public face of the family. But what I really want to focus on is the metaphor itself defines kephale. If you look closely, it describes Jesus as the Savior, right? And so the source of our life. It's not that he's the leader. In Greek, if you wanted to say leader, there are words to use for that. And head is not one of them. A fellow by the name of Wayne Grudem, back in the 80s.
He was my seminary professor.
Interesting.
I know.
He was very committed to having head mean leader, and he looked at from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD in all the Greek texts. And he could come up with just about 2% on his account of kephale, meaning leader. But almost 1% of that, almost 2%, was Septuagint translation. So the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, but around 200 BC, it was translated into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. So in the Hebrew language, and also in English, when we say head, it can metaphorically mean leader. It's not a problem. So in Hebrew, they can use head, and it means leader. But in Greek, he could not find, but maybe at the most 1%. Except then you add another almost 1% from the Septuagint. But the Septuagint is translating from a language that uses head as leader. So it's not in the original language, right? Am I making sense? Do you mansplain for me here?
No, I'm not saying.
I know, but I'm exhausted, and you can probably, you're a night owl. You can explain this better.
Paul has a perpetually furrowed brow this whole time. He's just like concentrating. Okay, we've lost Paul. Were you done? Can Cole jump in, or because we have so many questions?
Yeah, so all I'm saying is that Greek, put yourself in the Ephesians position, okay? I mean, we're back in Ephesus. There's lots of beautiful mosaics around us, beautiful. The Artemis Temple is gorgeous. There's no flush toilets, however, or hot showers, so we're not going to stay long. But as we're sitting there and you're listening to this being read and you're a Greek speaker, when you hear kephale, it is not going to jump to your mind leader. It's just not. And even if you knew the Septuagint, which Paul knows very well, Matthew knows very well, it's the Bible of the earliest Christians because they're out in the Greco-Roman world. So they're using their Greek text, which is what they, many of the Jews would only have known Greek, I think, in certain cities in Asia Minor and Corinth and all that. So when they get this metaphor, what's going to come into their mind? Well, Paul helps them out. He says that Jesus is the Savior, so that connecting with the source of life and not authority over it. Now, Jesus is the authority over the church. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that this metaphor for the first century Greek speakers in Ephesus, it's not going to take it.
Okay, Cole, if you want to jump in, that's great. And then I want to the next thing.
I don't.
Oh, wonderful. For the complementarians, what do you do with 1 Corinthians 11, 5-6, which is the women prophesying, which assumes that women are prophesying in a congregation? For Paul, prophecy is given priority even over teaching as the greatest gift and is a word given directly from God to others in the congregation.
I say amen to what the Bible clearly says, that women were prophesying in Corinth. And
Can women prophesy at your church?
Yes. Yes,
Awesome.
they can. They absolutely can, yeah.
Great. If you guys, any women feel prophecy-ish this Sunday, you can go to Sojourn Montrose and speak a word. All right. I'm moving us on. Is Leah Thomas the world's answer to egalitarianism? Leah Thomas is the swimmer that's a trans woman.
University of Pennsylvania.
There is a question there. I mean, the person I don't think is just being spicy. I'll ask it again. Is Leah Thomas the world's answer? What? Oh. Well, did anyone want to say anything to that, or should we move on? Okay, great. What's the correlation between spiritual gifts like pastoring, teaching, prophesying, etc., and church leadership roles in the New Testament? What's the correlation between spiritual gifts like pastoring, teaching, prophesying, etc., and the church leadership roles in the New Testament?
The charismata in, Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians, both Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12 both have charismata. And then in Ephesians 4, it's gift, Doran, I think. But it's totally different. It's not charismatic. I think one of the issues that, or that's kind of bubbling up in my tired brain, is this, it's like the gifting of the Spirit. It seems to be no problem between complementarians and egalitarians because it's a Spirit moving. It's offices in the church. That is where the rub comes. Are those offices in the church, which, at least in Paul's letters, you've got episcopoi and diakonoi at the beginning of Philippians, and he doesn't bring that up usually. I mean, he doesn't bring it up anywhere else in his letters, in the address to groups, which leads some people to think that Yodi and Syntyche are at least the diakonoi, if not the episcopoi, which could be translated as overseers and all of that. I would recommend this book called Icons of Christ by William Witt. It's Baylor University Press, and I'm thinking it's in the last 3 years or so. But that book lays out in almost encyclopedic form the positions of both the Catholic and Protestant churches on the roles of women in the church, going through the scriptures and how they've been interpreted. And it's really very helpful. You'll probably see your view represented there in some way, but you'll also see other positions and how they argue for them. Find it fascinating that, as you mentioned, the Catholic Church and the, let's say, Southern Baptists come to a similar conclusion about the relative authority that women have vis-a-vis men in the church, but through very different theological paths, which is kind of interesting.
I'm just gonna move us on to the next question, and I want someone that hasn't spoken a lot to jump in first. I just want to make sure we hear from everybody. Why did Jesus only pick men for the 12 if he intended an egalitarian church? Was the Son of God limited by culture norms? Why did Jesus only pick men for the 12 if he intended an egalitarian church? Was the Son of God limited by culture norms?
Everybody's limited by cultural norms. So I'll say the 12, so he's doing a restoration movement in which he's inaugurating the restoration of the 12 scattered tribes of Israel. So Israel was one people group made up of 12 tribes. They broke the covenant. Within that history, they broke up into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdoms were 10 tribes, the so-called Israel in the prophetic literature. And then the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. So that's Israel and Judah. And then in the restoration, they're promised that they will be reunited into 12, into the 12 tribes will be reunited once again in the restoration. And Jesus, being the agent and herald of this restoration, is doing that work of reuniting the 12 disparated tribes. Each of the 12 tribes had an autonomous leader that was male. So he picked 12 men to be the leaders of the 12 tribes because they were historically the eponyms, which means the leader, the male representatives of the family were the names of the tribes. So I agree that, yeah, of course, obviously Jesus only picked 12 men, but that's because he's trying to signal the fact that he is doing the work in restoring the 12 tribes. That's not the same thing as asking and answering the question about functions within a office, leadership in a community that worships him.
This question I'm going to put to the complementarians. It's basically just saying why. If complementarianism is arguing that men and women are equal in all other ways, socially, politically, culturally, etc., then why do you argue that only men are granted roles of church head leadership? What reason would God have to not allow women to preach? I'll say it one more time. I saw like a weird, what? If complementarianism is arguing that women and men are equal in all other ways, socially, politically, culturally, etc., then why do you argue that only men are granted roles of church head leadership? What reason would God have to not allow women to preach?
It's the order of creation. This is very, very controversial, and some of you are going to wince. There's male headship before the fall. The church is the picture of the perfection in creation before the fall. Adam had a stewardship over Eve. The word stewardship is a responsibility. The consequences for Adam failing in his stewardship fell upon all of creation. The consequences for Eve's disobedience were not as consequential as Adam. The church is a picture of the restored perfection that there is, and there's order, there's stewardship from that shepherd teacher role. And personally, there is in Ephesians 5:32, where Paul is saying, and this is the mystery that I speak of, the relationship of Jesus to the church. That is a key verse that a lot of people overlook it, because that whole passage right there hinges on that verse, because that's what Paul is actually talking about, the relationship of the church with Christ.
Yeah, I would start first with like hermeneutical principle, that's a big word for saying how is it that we read and interpret the Bible. My number one hermeneutical principle, which betrays my evangelical tendencies, is that this is God's word and God is good. And so his word is good, which means that when I encounter things in his word that make me uncomfortable, of which we do not have time to divulge all of the texts in the word that make me uncomfortable, I have to recognize that even though it makes me uncomfortable, it's good, and that if I have a big problem with it, that I'm the problem, God's not the problem. Second, there are very able and compelling biblical arguments for the egalitarian position. And so there's not just like a gotcha, this is just obvious, how could you argue anything otherwise? Third, I begin in creation with man created with a telos, or an end, to which God made him. The most specific end to which God made him was to work and keep the garden, to cultivate, to expand, to protect the garden. He was given Eve as a helper, and that was already ably said that is not a weak helper. This is a battle mate. This is someone who is actively engaging in the work of working and keeping, and yet the federal responsibility, I say federal meaning, I'm a covenantal guy, so like I'm showing my cards here, but Adam had a federal role in the garden and in his family. And then we have some ideas of, okay, so what do we do with gender in the Bible? Well, first I want to look at pattern. What is the overwhelming pattern in the Bible? It's male leadership. The vast majority of leadership in the Bible is male. Now, that does not mean there's not female leadership in the Bible, even in the Old Testament. There are queens like Esther, who are praised for being worthy. There are prophetesses. There's a female judge. There is no female in the priesthood. There is a specific nature of being the liturgical head and representative of the people of God that God has given to men. I think that follows through into the New Testament, to which the question is asked, well, what about the priesthood of all believers? Doesn't that absolve the idea of priesthood? And to an extent, yes. If you read Hebrews, what you see is the author of Hebrews showing that the priesthood, as it were, in the Mosaic covenant is abolished because Christ has fulfilled the sacrificial necessity of the priesthood. He's fulfilled the mediatory necessity of the priesthood, and he's made the presence of God available at the throne of God to all people who have been washed in his blood through faith and baptism. And so that means if you're a Christian, you have access to the fullness of God, male or female, slave or free, Jew or Gentile. This is the Galatians language that Paul refers to. And so what does that mean for any distinctions between male and female? Well, there is still this idea of liturgical headship, of which a husband plays that role in the home, and the pastor elder plays that role in the church. And we see these commanded in the New Testament. In Ephesians 5, we see it in 1 Timothy 2, and they're the most plain readings of the text. That doesn't mean that when you look into historical context and get into all these other things that there aren't arguments to the contrary, but the most plain reading of 1 Timothy 2 is that the authoritative teaching of the church is for men. And Paul couches his reasoning in the creation narrative, not in any appeals to combating against the cult of the goddess Artemis or any Ephesian context. He talks about the garden and the fall as the nature of male and female relationship. All the while, he is throughout his letters proclaiming a radical equality in worth and dignity between male and female.
Before I pass it to Paul, who wants to say something, I'm supposed to ask you, Cole, if you consider yourself a priest.
No, but I do think as an elder and as a husband, I have a priestly function.
Ooh, fancy. Okay, Paul?
No, thanks. That was helpful. That laid a lot of the issues out, I think. So I think a few things. One thing when we use the patterns in the Old Testament as examples that reify prescriptive functions in the New. So, for example, simply using descriptive elements of the Old Testament or whatever, or even just cultural context of the time, to function as paradigms or examples that should dictate prescriptive norms for subsequent generations, you get into the mistake of collapsing just the fact of the way things were for the way things ought to be. So, for example, in saying that, well, yeah, there was all male judges and only one exception, Deborah, and therefore that functions prescriptively, that's making the mistake, in my opinion, of using descriptive elements, there were male judges, to function prescriptively. There only ought to have been male judges, right? So that then you get the example of a female judge and say, that's an exception, that was a weird time in Israel's history, right? Similarly, just to use the function of only male priests to then use to function, which is a descriptive fact, to then function prescriptively. Therefore, only female, only
that
male
is
prescriptive priests, right? Say what?
A male-only priest is prescriptive.
Is prescriptive.
It's a command of God.
No, I understand, yeah. It's also only a commandment of Levites. Jesus is also a priest, and he's not a Levite. And there's a reason for that, because I understand, it's from Hebrews, yeah. No, I understand. And so my point is to say that the prescription might still be based on other factors. So the fact that God might have prescribed only males can be priests is not because he's prescribing priests ought to be male because they are male. There might be other factors that contribute to the fact that only priests can be male for other reasons. For example, since y'all have interjected a few times about priesthood, the condition that's required for priests to officiate at the altar is
Something about blood.
Circumcision.
no, not circumcision. Purity, physical purity.
Yeah.
Physical purity. One of the conditions that affected your physical purity on the regular, as they say, was females' guesses, menstruation, thank you, or childbirth even. And so there might be reasons why your femaleness that might preclude your capacity to be a priest regularly, namely the fact of your menstruation or childbirth statuses. So it is true that God prescribes males only as being able to be priests, but that's not because of their maleness. It might be because of other factors that might have precluded their capacity to approach the altar regularly. For example, I'm sorry? Did you say Mary? Question
He
mark?
wants Meredith to say something. He's fangirling. Continue.
Kip, you maybe lose my train of thought.
Well, I want to get to one last question before we go. So,
Well, and this is sort of the issue. We reduce the issue to the fact of the way things were in given text, and then make it function prescriptively. So you can say, yeah, males only were prescribed, but that doesn't mean that's because the prescription was based on the fact that they were males. Similarly, you get, like, for example, priests are not permitted to approach dead bodies, but that's because of the fact that if they approach dead bodies, they'll procure a stage of impurity that's quite strong that prohibits them from doing their priestly duties. So I think the basis for their preclusion from participation in the priesthood is not based on their femaleness, qua femaleness, but because of other factors that contribute to their incapacity to approach. That also then relates to, you mentioned earlier, I believe this is the word of God and not, you almost used, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so if I'm wrong, you didn't say this, It sounded to me like something like we believe this, and yeah, there are exceptions to this interpretation in the egalitarian camp, but like we take it for its word in plain sense and non-contextual sort of things. I'm not trying to put your words in your mouth. You didn't say it that way. So
Thank you.
Yeah, you didn't say it that way. So he didn't say it that way. But there are ways of interpreting 1 Timothy 2 that take it that way. Like, well, the plain sense of 1 Timothy 2 is I don't prohibit a woman to teach into althintane means that X, Y, Z. But all interpretation, all acts of communication are contextually interpreted things. All acts of communication are conditioned by their cultural location. For example, raise your hand if you know the word riz.
I want to be cool, so I'm going to raise my hand.
All right. All right, you don't. It's fine. We don't have to use the example. But there's a reason that like half the room raised their hand and you didn't. It's because even though we're participants in the same culture, we don't all know the same lexeme, the same word, because of our non-recognition of these facts. Like the fact is that all cultural, all communication depends upon other implicit other assumed knowledge within our cultural context that doesn't permit communication or not. So the fact that like, hey, this is the plain reading, this is kind of an overstatement, but it's really not. There's really not that many plain readings. All readings depend upon implicit cultural context.
Okay.
I want to give 2 examples.
Okay, we have like
1
2
Tim
minutes, so.
Okay, well,
yeah.
not fast. That clock's slow.
That clock is slow, yep.
So we're going to go with that one.
We have some more things to do before 9, yes.
In 1 Tim 2:9, women dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. So you know what? For me, if I'm reading that very literally, I just wear my diamonds that are in platinum. Is that stupid? It's totally stupid. But I'm not wearing gold. And then let me say again, if we're going to take something literally, 15. But she will be saved, sozo, the word that's translated everywhere else in Paul as salvation. She will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness. If I take that verse literally, I know that I'm saved because I have 2 live children who live to adulthood.
You're extra
saved. That again
saved.
is stupid. Like that is terrible exegesis. Do not repeat this.
And honestly, the fact is that the basis for the difference is not simply the cultural context issue. Like I agree that the Artemis thing can be a silly example. You're like, oh well, we don't know anything about Artemis. He doesn't say Artemis. Okay, I grant that. Should younger widows get remarried? In 1 Corinthians 7, he says no. In 1 Timothy 5, he says yes. Which command of Paul should they obey? 1 Corinthians 7 or 1 Timothy 5? Clearly, there seems to be an issue in 1 Timothy that results in the different prescription. Paul's giving a prescription in both. Both are clearly contextually determined. If you want to ask your question, if you're a young widow, should I get married or not? You follow 1 Corinthians 7 or 1 Timothy 5?
We're red and green for Christmas, Mark.
1 Tim 5,
Wait.
that the term that we translate as widow is actually virgin. It's virgin because the young unmarried is a new cultural concept and they don't have language for it. And I say that because early 2nd century, there's a letter where Bishop Ignatius is writing to someone saying those young widows or the young virgins also called widows, or the young widows also called virgins. It's 9 o'clock and my brain's off. But anyway,
That's okay. I told Meredith, because she hasn't talked much, that she could have the last word tonight. But I will tell you this, before Meredith says her last word, and then we're going to pray and sing and take a picture. If you guys want to come ask the questions that maybe didn't get asked, I'm going to ask these guys if they would stick around and you can come up and ask them your question. But Meredith. Well, she got time at the beginning. So
on that literal hermeneutic thing that they were kind of going off on. It's because the literal hermeneutic gets a really bad rap sometimes for comments just like that. But when you take a literal hermeneutic, you don't just take that one sentence and then take it literally. You have to also look at it contextually and historically. within the same author, the same book, the multiple books, and then within the context of the
Sure.
whole Bible. So I know that some people, we facetiously say, well, if I take it this and I take it literally and I apply it to my life now, there's multiple steps in between before we get to the application in our current lives, before we get to that actual. So, and when he's saying the plain text, he's saying without exorbitant metaphor, because a lot of people read a lot of metaphor into the text. And when we do a literal hermeneutic, we're saying that we're not going to do that.
Sure.
So that's to clarify that.
Mary
All
Bear.
of the stories that were told reminded me of something. When I was growing up, like as I said, my father was my senior pastor, and I went through a phase of reading all this stuff and playing devil's advocate with him because I knew he was a egalitarian, and so, and this was when I was feeling called into ministry, and so I was bringing arguments to him and letting him bring it back to me. And we talked on and off for a couple nights, and finally, at one point, he turns to me and he's like, "Meredith, you are never going to be preaching to people in first century Ephesus. You are fine." And I was like, "You're right." Like like talking about the literalism, like he gave me this whole interpretation of like, this is how I read all of these texts. This is how I read all of these texts. This is a consistent reading of the entire New Testament, and this is why I think this is here, and this is why I think that your call is valid. So I thought that was a closing story.
Love it. Oh my gosh, so many questions we didn't get to. Let me give you a couple quick announcements, then I'm going to have Beth come up and pray us out, and then we're going to be photogenic. So put your lip gloss on. All right, upcoming things. January 18th, what? Did you want some? Everyone. We're being egalitarian with the lip gloss. Yes. January 18th is our next big event. We are going to the Sugarland area. Everybody is going. This isn't just for the people who live in Sugarland. Take a field trip, pack some snacks. It is OTL. That's outside the loop for those of you that aren't in the, okay. But it's going to be really fun. We're going to be talking about is social justice, biblical justice. Then in February, we're going to be tackling Protestant purgatory. What? March, we're going to be talking about if the Bible sometimes gets it wrong. Does it have mistakes? Does it have contradictions? April, we're going to tackle just LGBT issues, and we'll go from there. So those are some upcoming things that you have to look forward to. Remember this Saturday, the beer that won is going to be at New Magnolia Brewery. Remember to turn in your seat cards at the little basket over there to help us with our podcast. Buy or just take some of our merch. Literally just be thieves on the way out. Just grab pint glasses and go. I mean, give what you think is fair. Will you pray for us? And then we're going to take a picture. So get ready.
God, we just thank you so much for bringing all of us out here tonight. We thank you for the charitable conversation that has been able to happen. We thank you for the humility that we've seen from both sides on this issue. And we thank you first and foremost, God, that we are all called and made in your image, knowing that that means that we have roles and responsibility to represent you first and foremost in everything that we do, whether it be teaching, whether it be pastoring, whether it be just everyday conversation and living out the gospel that you have called us to, God. We just thank you that we can have these conversations. We thank you for just the love that you have given us through your Spirit. And we thank you for just everything that you are and that you have created in both men and women, and the calls that you have given them to equip disciples for loving you and loving your word. We just ask that as people leave this room, that they would be edified and that they would grow in knowledge of you first and foremost, and that they would be continuously asking more questions about this topic and what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man who is a follower of Jesus. We thank you and we love you, and just help us to have a wonderful rest of Advent and a wonderful rest of the Christmas season. We love you. In your precious name we pray. Amen.